because they're only receiving 50% of the speed of the icon. So you can see you can vary the speed in that manner. Another option that you have is to use the icon orientation. And this is actually quite a useful feature, but it's actually a little bit buggy in the current implementation of particle flow. I'll show you exactly how that bug appears. If we change the influence to 75% is actually fine, and we press play, you can see that the actual icon, when it goes to the top of its arc, rotates. So the orientation of the icon changes. But this currently has no effect on the particles. So if we turn on use icon orientation and we press play, now you'll see that as the orientation of the icon changes, the particles are swung around by it. And you can see this happens throughout the entire animation. So at the end here, the orientation is jiggling around, and you'll see that this actually causes your particles to jiggle around here as well quite a lot. So it has quite a big effect actually on the motion of your particles. And the way it actually applies to your particles is the orientation is applied as a rotation based on the center of the icon. So that's actually why it swings the particles around so much in this particular example here. I'll just turn off speed variation. So there they go up again, and you can see they get swung around there by the orientation of the icon. Now the bug that I was talking about is actually in influence. Now influence would normally mean that the use icon orientation would have less of an effect. If we use less influence, then that influence would also come through onto the icon orientation. But as it turns out, this isn't actually hooked up. So it is actually hooked up to the position of the icon, but it's not actually hooked up to the orientation of the icon. So if I use a very low value and press play, you can see the position of the icons isn't actually affected. Sorry, the position of the particles isn't affected much by the icon, but you can see that when the orientation animation kicks in, the particles are affected a great deal. They're actually swung around massively through space. So you can see that the actual influence value isn't hooked up correctly to the use icon orientation. So that's something to be aware of, and something to obviously avoid in production if you can. So I'll just turn that off, and we'll have a look on at steer towards trajectory. This actually makes your particles head towards your icon. There are two parameters used here. There's the activation parameter, the tick box, and there's the distance parameter. And what the distance parameter does is it says any particles which are actually further away than this particular value, within this value actually, don't get affected by the steer towards trajectory effect. So if you set a very large value here, any particles which are actually within that value, they don't actually move towards the icon. And you can see that I'm using a value here of 0, and that means that all the particles will actually move towards the icon. So if I press play, you can see that they immediately all converge on the icon there. If I change this value to let's say 10, you can see that it's only actually the particles which are actually very close to the icon that actually converge on it. And as I increase this value, you can see that more and more particles actually don't converge on the icon. So it has a lessening of an effect rather than increasing it. So it's actually quite counterintuitive in many respects, I suppose. So if I change it to a very large value, to 120 units, basically it won't actually have any effect on the particles anymore. So you can limit the effect of the operator by actually, of this particular parameter within the operator, by actually increasing this value here. So again, quite useful if you want your particles to, head in towards the center of your icon. And you can actually use this in multiple events. In your first event, you could actually have them pulse in towards the icon, and then you could pass them on to another event after a few frames where they just basically follow your the icon animation. We'll just have a look at the next few parameters, which don't really need demonstration because they're basically very standard to the way operators work in particle flow. We have the animation offsets, which we've seen in a lot of other operators, and these work in exactly the same way as they do in other operators, but in this particular case there are actually two of them. We have parameters animation, and we have icon animation. So you can animate these parameters here, and you have the usual options here with absolute time, particle age, and event duration to actually offset those parameters animations in time. And you also have then the icon animation. And this then allows you to actually apply the icon's animation to the particles with an offset in time. And you can see during this demonstration I've actually been using particle age. And the other options are absolute time, with absolute time, all your particles will get exactly the same motion, which isn't really that attractive most of the time. You can see here they're all completely synchronized with each other. With particle age, obviously with particles with a variance in age, you'll get a variety in the way the animation is applied to your particle. It gets offset in time, so you get more variety. And then if you have your particles being passed to another event, you can actually use the event duration. And that will obviously vary the application of the icon's animation based on the event duration. So, you know, you've got the usual options there. Then you have the icon size, which obviously controls the icon size. That's purely a cosmetic thing for working with it in the viewport. And below this option you have color coordinated. And this particular option is used with all the particle flow operators that actually have an icon, which you see in the viewport. And what this actually does is, if I turn it off, you can see that it's got a default color, which you can see in this case is a kind of bluey, greeny color. But you can also synchronize that color with the display operator. So you can see in this case we're using a sort of canary yellow. So if we go to the speed by icon and we turn on color coordinated, the icon becomes the same color as the display operator. And that just basically gives us more of a view, a cue in the viewport to see what event that particular icon is associated with. So again, it's just a workflow help to the user. And finally, we have the uniqueness parameters, which are pretty much the same as the other uniqueness parameters seen in other operators in particle flow. So there we go. That's the speed by icon operator. You can see it's very specialist in the way it's actually used. It gives you direct animated control of your particle's motion, which is very, very useful. But that usefulness is mitigated in some respects by the fact that it does take over total control of your particles, and so it's harder to actually blend it with other particle motion that you may have going on in your scene. Okay, let's move on to the next operator, which is the keep apart operator.